Our topic this week is classic American popular song. Now, that term could apply to a lot of different kinds of popular music, certainly a lot that's being written today, but it generally covers a rather limited time period. And when that phrase is used, it's usually referring to music from the 1920s up until about 1950, not a real long period of time. This was the dominant music of the time. It was used in motion pictures, in musical theater, in radio broadcasting, in sales for amateur musicians at home, and it was played by dance bands, by jazz bands. It was definitely the music of the culture at the time. It was supplanted by rock and roll starting in the early 50s. It's never quite disappeared, but it's definitely not in the spotlight that it used to have. And I think that spotlight is worth spending or worth shining on the music. And musicians like myself are sort of coming on board. When I was young, I was very much a kind of a classical egghead, and I didn't have any use for popular music. And as I've gotten older, I have found more and more to appreciate in the popular music, not of my time, but of the time of my parents and grandparents. And other musicians of the present day have done that. There's a lot of emphasis on that with music lovers and with classical musicians. One book, it's not real recent, this is from the 1950s, but it states something very strongly. This author, writing in 1955, for the benefit of other classical musicians, he wrote, "There is more real creative musical talent in the music of Gershwin, Rodgers, Kern, and Berlin than in all the serious music composed since 1920. I kind of enjoy reading a very opinionated statement like that. And he named probably the four most prominent composers of popular song during the golden age of that type of writing. Other authors, here is a classical musician who has written a detailed study of several hundred of these songs. He dates from 1900 to 1950. And there are other books that I have referred to recently that deal with this body of music. But we don't need to go into that. I don't want to get into too much detail here. So, American popular song was the 20s to the early 50s with some spillover on both sides. What makes it noteworthy? Well, for one thing, it was music that was written by real specialists, by songwriters who mostly did primarily that. They were not performers. That's the big difference between that era and the rock and roll era. Most rock and roll groups play their own songs, or at least some of their own songs, and with almost no exceptions, the major writers of the era of classical American song were not performers. They were writing for other people to perform. Not only that, but most of them were divided rather clearly into the composers who wrote the music and the lyricists who wrote the words. There were a few exceptions. Irving Berlin was probably the most famous, who wrote both. Well, where were these songs done? Well, I could divide it up, I suppose, into three areas. Broadway, which is musical theater, Hollywood, which is movies, and Tin Pan Alley. That's a term for the music publishing district in New York that published pop music. And those songs were often not associated with any shows or any movies, but they were just there, just made available for sale for people who found them interesting. And all of these would end up, of course, being broadcast on radio and being available as sheet music for ordinary people to buy. So the original form of these songs usually was printed sheet music. And then individual performers, whether they're at home or whether they're professionals on the stage or in the movie or in a concert hall or a nightclub or something like that, they would make their own versions of these depending on how elaborate they wanted to be or what kind of a band or orchestra or group that they had with them. Well, let me talk a little bit about the major composers. There are so many that I would get lost rather quickly if I tried to cover a large number. So I'm going to go with the 4 names that were mentioned on that book. Jerome Kern, probably the oldest of that group, he was born in 1885. You probably don't know his name, but you might know the show Showboat, and you probably have heard the song Old Man River from that show. That is by Jerome Kern. He wrote several hundred songs, I think about 700, and lived until 1945. He was 60 years old, and he's considered sort of the father of the classic American song, the first really prolific and very highly regarded composer. And of course, he worked with other people to having the words written for him. The next most important is probably Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin lived to an age of 101. He was born in 1888 and died in 1989. And he wrote probably 1,500 songs at least. Nobody knows for sure because there's a lot of songs he finished but never published, and so the Berlin estate probably still has some of those in manuscript. He wrote for a number of Broadway shows and a number of movies, and his best known show is probably Annie Get Your Gun, which has the song There's No Business Like Show Business. He also wrote White Christmas, and he wrote God Bless America. So those are some songs that you've probably encountered. The next most important would have to be George Gershwin. Gershwin was a brilliant pianist and wrote hundreds of songs for musical theater, plus a handful of pieces for the concert hall. Rhapsody in Blue is probably his most famous single work, but mostly he wrote songs, and he did write one opera called Porgy and Bess, and I'm sure you've heard Summertime from Porgy and Bess. The fourth of those composers mentioned was Richard Rodgers. He was born in 1902, and he lived until 1979. He had a very long career because he worked very closely with one particular poet named Lorenz Hart, who died at the age of 48, and Rodgers was only 40. So after that, he wrote music with a poet named Oscar Hammerstein II. And the shows that they wrote for Broadway are some that you might know. The Sound of Music is probably the most famous, or Oklahoma, or The King and I, or South Pacific. And so there's probably a couple dozen songs of theirs you know. Edelweiss would be one. The Sound of Music from the show of the same name. From Oklahoma, there's Oh, What a Beautiful Morning. There's Getting to Know You from The King and I. A lot of those, probably. Okay, well, that's just a little overview of the major composers. And with some of the songs we're going to see in more detail, I'll get into a bit more about those composers. But what makes these songs excellent? Well, I think we can divide it into 3 things. There is melody, and there is harmony, and there are lyrics. And for the sake of simplicity, we're going to just look at the melody. Now the harmony, the chords, that can be really, really rich. You notice that I didn't do which doesn't really fit. It's not very interesting. It was so when the composer writes one of these songs, he doesn't just come up with the tune, the notes that the singer sings, or that the lead trumpeter or the violin section plays, but he comes up with a whole bunch that really help to give a lot of depth to the song. So that's a worthy topic. I'd love to get into it, but it would take us forever because I'd get into too many side topics. The lyrics are another wonderful topic. What makes the lyric for a song effective is not necessarily the same as what makes a poem effective. These lyrics have to be very short. They have to have rhymes, and they have to have some kind of a punchline, probably the title, in the song itself. But again, this is a worthy topic. I'd love to get into it, but I'm not an expert on lyrics, and I'm just going to leave that for now. We're going to talk about the melody. And let's take that song I was just playing.